Alrighty, I just haven't been satisfied with how long it's been taking to give a description of this, so let me try again to be about as swift as I possibly can, because we're on a backup of my survival world, which I've updated to 1.12 for demonstration purposes. And I do believe that this machine works pretty much flawlessly even into current versions, and I've built the mock-up here so that I can more accurately describe what's buried over there, because at least here you can see better what's going on. Now, there are many ways. I would say there's just as many ways to farm a skeleton as there are players that exist in this game. But this is my favorite way, and I had designed the machine originally on a 1.13 Theosub fan server, and I've updated it slightly, but only slightly, to work across various version ranges, and I'll describe the various changes that you could include as I go through. Now let's start with the spawning area for a skeleton. Now, the obsidian represents the mob spawner block, and the 3 blocks above that need to be dug out, I think is pretty analogous with the dungeon's actual generation, although the 2 glass blocks represent the spot where a skeleton could actually spawn, and the extra block is just a safety. I forget the version exactly that it's in, but originally it was an 8x8 area, which was later updated to a 9x9 area around the spawner that a mob can spawn, which means that outwards by 4 blocks it can spawn a mob. However, this can be offset by a half of a block, which means that you need 1 more block around to represent that half block, making it actually an 11x11 chamber. Now, you can flush that chamber with a single source block column from the side if you put a bottom slab, at the first 4 spots, and then close to the center of the chamber allow it to flow over, and then flow the rest of the way before we get to the edge. Now, here at the edge, I'll go into a bit of detail, is that we want to push the mob into a 2-height zone. But the mob loves to jump, and it'll jump up against the block. Because of the slab, however, it gives an extra half of a block worth of space for them to get underneath the full block before being pushed up with the stair and dropped into a 2-height area for further processing. And then we'll extend that area in some way or another before we get to the next spot where there's a 2-block gap, where once again we've got the slab just before the spot that we want to push them under, and a stair at the level that we're pushing them to give that 2.5 block gap until they're halfway past the gap itself, preventing them from jumping too awful much and clogging the system excessively. Now, I should mention the area below the spawner because that's extremely important. The spawner itself checks these first 4 blocks, which means that the next few blocks represent after 1, 2, 3, 4, head, foot, jump space, water, floor. Except for in versions before 1.4, where you want to have double depth water by removing all of these blocks here and letting the downward flowing source occupy its space, where the mobs will be pushed from their head slot, and this works even in version 1.13, and particularly in there, mobs don't attempt to swim. So it's almost as useful in much more current versions as it is in extremely early versions. Now, once we're actually clear of the chamber, which should happen relatively quickly because it's also pretty small and they move through the current decently fast. We're in the first bit that I think is different from most normal worlds. We normally want to use something like a sign, a fence gate, a pressure plate, God knows what, to make the continuation of the water source if we're going to keep it at the same level. However, by putting a pair of iron bars or fences on either side diagonally like this, we've got no real gap for them to get stuck in as they travel from one stream to another, and then that's repeated over here just before the elevator. Now, at the actual elevator, if the blocks there were in position, the mob can get stuck here or here, but by removing the blocks in both of these locations, we add a current which drags them in from the foot level until they're at the corner of the block. Now, in 113 and above, this would be where you would put your bubble column by replacing the block that I'm standing on with soul sand and using solid source blocks all the way up. But in 112 and below, you might consider using an air block every other block to provide breathing room for the mobs on their way up. Now, as they travel up, they of course have already been aligned, and then we've got ourselves a bit of a viewing area here. And I think that the viewing area itself its appearance would be ruined with blocks breaking up the appearance of the smooth and continuous water. So we can have water sources all the way and expect the mob to swim, at least in 112 and below. But as we reach the top of it, where we probably want to put more breathing spots, we've got the water itself offset by a block to have the source directly beneath the block upon which the ladder is placed, to push the head of the mob away from the ladder itself, allowing the mob to continue rising seamlessly until he reaches the top where we would handle him. Now, when looking at the viewing area, I really like to have one of these, no matter what it is, especially if it's in a survival world, simply for the cosmetic appeal of watching the mobs travel past. Now, I like the idea of the magma block because it's a full block, which technically allows light to pass, and behind the magma block we've got glowstone, making the light levels 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, and then as it reaches the ice itself, we've got 10, which is not enough to melt the ice, leaving the ice safe. So you can use it as part of the cosmetic appeal behind it all. And in certain old versions, it also makes the water itself behind the ice disappear, which is an added bonus for at least a period of time if you plan on playing an old version. Now, at the top, from the spot where we eventually pull the mob back out of the water, we've got a somewhat minimalistic holding area, as well as pushing them on in about whatever means necessary. That's all not too terribly important. But once we come to the end, we don't necessarily want to have a sign here at the end. We kind of want that to be a thin water source. And because mobs like to jump around, we've got a top slab just over their head, allowing them, yes, to jump around, as the water continues to push them into the cobweb. Now, as they fall from the cobweb, they'll accelerate just as the top of their head leaves the bottom of the cobweb, leaving it an extremely consistent fall height. And you could replace both of these blocks with solid blocks, so long as you're not aiming very specifically at having them only at a half of a heart. Although I may have these ones actually closer to a full heart after the entire fall, just because of a few spots where there's a half block gap. Now, speaking of the fall, from the level of this gold block being equal to this water current, we've got 1, 2, 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, with a fence gate which is being controlled at the 21st block. Now, starting from the top of this area here, we've got this tripwire hook powering this red block, which is coming down and directly powering the dot. The block that's powered by the dot is indirectly powering a piston, which is also being updated by a rail. As a mob enters the string itself, it will instantly push the redstone block away, instantly giving a hitbox to this fence gate. And then, of course, there's another fence gate above, making it to where both of the cobble walls on either side have a full hitbox in size, making it to where the mob shoots straight past, because there's only a half of a block gap that the tripwire hook itself is occupying. Now, from the fall itself, even if several mobs were to fall very close to each other, enough to keep the tripwire almost constantly activated, there would eventually be a bit of a wait, a bit of a lag, allowing it to depower and allowing the mobs to finish falling and processing. And then from that fall, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, with them landing on top of the 6th. And the first fall, I do believe, does 8 hearts. The second fall, I do believe, does 1 more heart worth of damage, which means that they're roughly at a 2-punch kill, which means that having something like a stone sword is extremely valuable, and only armored mobs would survive the stone sword. Now, in this area, we've got the 2-block holding cell, but this is a bottom trapdoor opening in the direction of the player, so that if you should open it manually, or it's functioning automatically, and for some reason a skeleton zips past before it can actually hit that, then it means that it won't have an opportunity to shoot you, keeping the player safe even at relatively low hit points. You'll be swinging away at the mob above the cobble wall and below the top trapdoor over on this side, making it significantly smaller than a half of a block gap that you're actually swinging at them, meaning the majority of the drops should be dropped out. Now, because they're standing on a bottom trapdoor, a skeleton is actually tall enough that it's still activating that tripwire, just barely, with the cobble walls in this case just holding them relatively close to not necessarily in the center of this block, but definitely on top of the trapdoor itself, without letting them skirt out past, which is beneficial at least. Now, after the last mob should die, the torch below this trapdoor will flicker, and that's because just behind this gold block is the location of this tripwire hook. The block that the tripwire hook is attached to is directly powering this upwards facing piston and indirectly powering this downwards facing piston. When mobs are inside of the tripwire, the piston itself is extended, which means that this falling edge pulse generator is primed, and then once the last dies, it retracts, and it gives a brief flicker there of the line, which also flickers the state of the torch on the other side. And these settings are about the shortest settings possible to still ensure that the loot from the mob should be able to drop. down into a water source. Now, viewed from the other side, we can see that if a mob falls past, we want it to land on top of this magma block, because that'll ensure that it dies. However, in 1.12 and earlier, the magma block tends towards deleting water, which is on top of it. So we've got the sources set a little ways back, safely out of the way, pushing diagonally across, and then it'll eventually, oh right, the skeletons are just too tall to pass underneath this trap door, making it to where they'll be stuck on top of both of those magma blocks until they've died. Whether it takes several seconds or a fraction of a second, they'll die either way. And then eventually they're pushed back, the drops are pushed back into this next area, where we've got a diagonal water source as well as several anvils, and they're set with the long axis being in the direction that you want items to pass, because items can actually pass in between the both of those, no matter where they should really land. There. And you see for both of those that it pretty well pushes them past. But this gap is too small for XP to actually push through, so the XP will all be trapped right here at the corner of this block, waiting for the player to be in such an area that it can be pulled backwards against the current, against gravity on top of the bottom trapdoor, and then back up in against the top trapdoor over here, where the player himself can actually absorb that XP. And although in certain axes, like it might work better on perhaps the X or the Z axis, depending on which version you're in, but for me, this works particularly well across an incredible version range. And I've seen other people, such as Pineapple Kekuchinovsky, do differently, using other blocks like Cake as means of XP separation. However, for me, I really like this setup, because it's reasonably safe, reasonably cheap, and you're never really going to use those anvils anyway, the ones that are inside of here. So it means that they pretty much last forever. And then of course afterwards, the drops themselves, you'll have them taken away for processing elsewhere. Now let's go ahead and go through everything at least once with some mobs, just to let you get a generalized feel for it, and I'll try to turn up the speed just a little bit to make it slightly less tedious for you than it is for me to watch them all go. Okie dokie, we're pretty close to the end, and I think that a few of them have died from cramming damage down inside of the chamber itself. But right, the distance here, it's somewhat important. From the edge of this room, being block number 5, we've got 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, which means that the player is well inside of range of keeping that operating. And then 16 being, that block there. So they are standing on block number 17. And block number 17 used to be somewhat important as being at least partially inside of the checked range for spawners. However, this is an old, depreciated, and changed rule from quite some time ago. However, I'll go into some detail about it when talking about the survival model. Now, the sword that you use to attack them isn't important. You could technically just use a potion and swap to the sword while it's in midair to get the looting effect from a potion instead. However, if you're in a version that's recent enough to have it, it's extremely nice to have mending, looting, and sweeping edge on pretty much any sword that you leave alongside a mob grinder, such as this, which is based on a spawner. And then in this case, because it's the undead, having Smite 5 on it is really quite nice, because it means that even the armored mobs are only a one-hit kill. And then all of the items have been shuffled out, and a good deal of XP is left behind, with the rest of the XP able to be absorbed from the platform over here. And then if we were to open this, grab a bottle of XP, and get the alignment good, I could show with far more XP than would probably be in the system that it relatively quickly washes it up and out of there and aligns it in that corner against the 3 anvils, waiting for the player to come through, where it'll be attracted to them and eventually absorbable, through the gap here. And now that we've taken a look at the mock-up, let's also take a look at the survival model, which is slightly more difficult to actually look at because it's all below ground. But it moves backwards, the entire build moves backwards all the way into beta and probably even before, with very few changes being necessary. Just because I didn't have access to a tripwire hook didn't mean that I was prevented from building. But first let's look at the room itself and the location of this gold block, because this is the center of a 4x4 chunk area, with this chunk here, everything behind it technically being in the safe zone. And I should describe what I mean by that. Mob spawners, although I can't prove it, actually do also look outwards by 8 blocks in all directions, and any chunk which they should intersect, the entirety of that chunk is added to a list which is checked by the mob spawner to know the precise location of any mob inside of it. So this chunk is being looked at by that mob spawner, as well as you see that this mob spawner is pretty close to the chunk border. It'll always be close enough to at least 2 chunk borders to be looking outwards at 3 chunks. And in this case, this chunk is being looked at by both mob spawners, making it unsuitable as a location for actually killing the mobs. However, this chunk is being looked at by neither of the mob spawners, making it ideal for loading up with all of the mobs. Now, and as well as having the primary bubble elevator, or in this case, just water column elevator. And then eventually, I meant to add a short pulse generator to that button, but eventually they reach over here, where they're dropped down into a spot that's safe enough for the player to, for example, use a potion to kill them. And naturally, this is a backup on a version beyond the version that I'm using, and I'm not going to be using this one for the survival world anymore. A backup is exactly that, just meant for demonstration and testing purposes. Now, let's dive on in so that you can see that in early versions you do need that double depth water, and any water source that they should land on inside of here is actually safe because it's far enough away from the mob spawner to prevent the mobs from being calculated, and also has a depth suitable to prevent any fall damage. Now, as they exit the chamber, instead of renewing the water source at the same level, I just went down by a block, and same for the other one. But just at the edge of the chamber, you can see that I've got, the slab bordered by the two stairs to make it the 2.5 block gap for getting underneath that gap there. We come into the diagonal water sources and are dragged in by the foot into the inside of the first water elevator, which meets up with the output from the first of the two spawners, so that they'll come across and end up landing basically right on top of the previous output's elevator. Now, once they're combined, they've landed inside of an area with a bottom slab, which makes it once again with that 2.5 block gap, which is so ideal for getting the mobs through in general, and then brings them together into another elevator, which is the one that has the viewing chamber. Now, I've got it broken up into several different elevators, primarily as my means of giving them breathing space on their way through. Although I could use ladders for giving them a breathing space, as I'm showing here. And then even if you're off by one when coming up, you can still have that diagonal water source through various means for pushing them from elevator to elevator until they're actually to the point that you're ready to drop them down and allow their shins to get broken. And that pretty much shows the setup that I use, not only for beta 1.9 pre-release 4, but also for version 113, 113 and above, with the only real change being the addition of a soul sand at the bottom of the water columns to push them up more efficiently. While I'm traveling past to show it one more time. Technically, you don't need these levers, and you can play with them all you want without them breaking a circle of locked repeaters. There's a few of you out there who know how I did it. And now we're back to the beginning to show once again just the general idea of the mock-up, describing what I would call a fully featured and truly update-proof concept for the farming of skeletons. Now, mind you, the area for a spider would be 2 blocks larger in all directions, changing it from an 11 by 11 square area to more appropriately a 15 by 15 square area, because the spiders are 1 block fatter because of their legs, and then you also need an additional block worth of safety to keep them from reaching out and touching the walls on their way out of the chamber. And in that case, over there where my quadruple spawner is, I washed them all to the center of the chamber, just to make doubly sure that they couldn't actually get out. In fact, let's travel over there very, very swiftly. Oh yeah, it's actually great to be able to see inside of here now. What's the closest one to the wall? Over on this one looks to be the closest one to some walls. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 as the spacing from the mob spawner from the walls to help make sure that the spiders can't reach out and touch it. Now, of course, cave spiders are significantly smaller than normal spiders, but that doesn't change much. And then once we're down to the center of the chamber, you can see that we've got some ladders here, making it to where there's just enough of an overhang to prevent them from grabbing the wall, as well as a bit of an underhang, making it to where even if they should pile up, they'll scourt out underneath the wall and eventually make their way over to underneath here through this 4 block wide gap for the very first portion of it, because trying to squeeze them down as quickly as possible just isn't entirely reasonable. But after we've cleared the entire area, let's take a look at that chunk border one more time. We can see that from this side, neither of these close ones can actually reach out 8 blocks and go over the chunk border, meaning that this direction is the most appropriate direction to push the mobs, because that one reaches over and touches this adjacent set of chunks, as well as this one reaching over and touching this adjacent set of chunks. And this direction over here could have been appropriate, because although both of these chunks are being checked, the next one in line would not be. But I went with this side instead, as the area where the spiders themselves are being held. Now, I do eventually need to update this to be thematically appropriate for 1.12, because the magic spider elevator, by sticking them in between a fence and an iron bar, doesn't necessarily work every time in a row for getting them into the upper chamber where I can inflict some crushing damage as means of processing them. But if we come back down below, you get a good chance to see that at the end of the first column, we've got a stair that's forcing them upwards. Now, if they were any fatter than a cave spider, this might not be appropriate, and we would be better off changing something. But we push them upwards across a pair of stairs, just enough to make it to where I feel comfortable combining the overall streams with another diagonal water stream both to pull them away from this area as well as push them in that generalized direction. Okay, I had a crash. It was because I had this thing open to LAN. My computer doesn't play well with that. Now, it pulls them both out of this area as well as pushing them off into this generalized direction, where once again we've got a diagonal water source more or less traveling perpendicular to the original direction, dragging them both away from the previous area as well as towards whatever is the next area, as well as up a stair block, which is perfectly sufficient for making sure that a spider doesn't try to stay hidden on top of a slab. And we go over and over through diagonal after diagonal, again and again, past a variety of different hitboxes to help keep them inside of the water the entire way through, until we've finished going up and around. Yeah, in fact, I can see it better from over here. Now, over and over and up by a single step, over and over again, being dragged further and further through the system. Oh, right, and my mushroom farm. There's one of its seeds. Until we're finally close to the end, where we drag them around the corner, and finally into a 1x1 area. But the 1x1 area is only after a great deal of various different directions to try and force them as well as it can into the next water column, before eventually reaching this diagonal spot here, where it wishes to combine them, as best as possible at least, into one unified stream. And there are a few spots where the spiders can jump backwards and down, but if we were to switch game mode, and can I just grab you? Yeah. And just spawn way too many spiders, it'll give a much better show of the feel that there is to actually handling the spiders. And even with too many spiders, they eventually sort themselves out. They eventually sort themselves out. And the entirety of this device was built in Beta 1.9. Now, there are a couple of very small spots where they can kind of get themselves stuck for at least a brief period of time, but they do also tend towards wanting to travel in the direction of the player, even through walls, and so will eventually at times dislodge themselves, depending on where the player is standing. And if I was in earlier versions, then the magic spider elevator would work flawlessly, but because the magic spider elevator is about the only portion of this which isn't entirely update proof, let me just try to move around a little bit. Yeah, those ones are really persistent about wanting to be where they are. And these ones are fighting very strongly against the magic spider elevator. There are other solutions once you reach a certain version range, and I'll probably eventually, once my survival model, Oh? What's this? You're actually trying to climb the magic spider elevator all the way? And then, of course, I've only been timing it. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Whoops. Right, I only counted to 9 before. Yeah, they are really trying to use the magic spider elevator. But that's one of the few things that was broken through the update range. There are better ways to go about trapping them these days. Aren't you gonna bite me? Ah, good. Yeah, they are trying their hardest to get trapped in that area. They really are. And that pretty much efficiently shows some of my solutions when it came to various mob spawner based uh, grinders for gaining XP and items, which overall has done me a great deal of good, as well as fueled a great number of my projects, which somewhat required an enchanted item. Now, one thing I should really consider doing, is showing one last project. There we are. Now we're at my special Origin stronghold, which was a 1.9 pre-release 4 exclusive item. And there we are over into the stronghold itself. We can see that I've been building. Oh, hello. You know. Now, these diameters that I'm working with, they are central and odd, so we can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, so that you know that it's odd. And then over here, we've got a radius equal to, I'm looking at 32 over here, and I'm looking at 32 over here. And then over for the outer diameter, I'm looking at a radius of 63. And then for the wall itself, I'm looking at 42 for its diameter, or radius. And then up on top, having it as 2 layers is extremely important, because sometimes when you come back through the end gateway, you're placed 1 block below the actual level of a floor, which means that you would fall through the floor, but by having it 2 layers thick, occupying layers 72 and layer 73, then it makes it to where even if you come back 1 block too shallow, you just have to jump by 1. And then we've got this at radius 85 and radius 102. So those are all of the radiuses that I'm working with for all of these. And then as we come outwards, you can see that I've been busy. Oh wow, that actually looks great with Fulbright from night vision on another project. And I had quite a bit of help. I went and looked at some of Ray's previous works to see what I could do exactly. I looked at Azumavoid's old videos to see how he did it on a few things. I talked to Deadly Dirt Block, Keiko Chinovsky, and Jan Matula to ask them for their insights on the entire matter. And as you can see, it's a vine farm, which is reliant on the idea that you'll have an Aqua Affinity helmet. And then once I'm in a version with a hopper, I believe that I can dig through right about there and have the output connect directly into a hopper, into a dropper elevator, and travel onwards over into this spot where I'll have a bunch of locked hoppers occupying this position, pointing into chests at those positions. And then I can show the rest of what I'm planning on for that in a moment. One thing that I was finding, just in my own experiments, before I even had a chance to ask them properly, was that you could reach 4 blocks efficiently while standing inside of a soul sand, and that you were moving slowly enough while in the soul sand to allow you to strike all 4 of the blocks on your way past. Now, on a pair of shears, I think that there's 238 durability. 238 divided by 4 is 59 and 1/2, which means that you need to go through 59 and 1/2 full slots to ensure that you have broken your shears. Inside of here, there's, well, 68 slots, but the first slot is occupied by a button, just to make sure that the rows are even with each other. However, there's 67 slots full of vines, which makes sure that maybe the last 2 or 3 slots will be broken with your fist after you've shattered your shears, given that you've allowed roughly an hour for all of the vines to regrow, which is good, because with it being the entire thing fits inside of a 5 chunk wide area when viewed from above, and also 7 chunks long, which means that there's 14 individual columns going across from one side to the other, and that entire circuit is roughly an hour in length, until you get to the very end, where you'll be handed one more set of shears and sent backwards back to the beginning of the entire farm to start again. Now, when I do build this entire thing again in a different location, out of around 700 and close to 50, I'm going to build 2 of these farms side by side, such that as you finish coming through the last row, instead of going back to the beginning, you'll just be handed a shear and then pushed to the side one more time. Let me run over here. In the same direction across the back row of another one identical to it, before you're pushed back, ziggle-zaggling back and forth across all of the rows again, making it to where you're still breaking vines on your way back to the front of the farm. And that should increase the output from roughly 55 vines a minute to about 66 vines a minute. It's not a tremendous increase, but it is an interesting idea. Now, this is not only the bare minimum size that you could build such a farm, but also the maximum size that you should ever build such a farm, because while you're inside of this chunk, you are definitely loading that chunk over there, and if you make it too much larger, you'll eventually get it to where, from the extreme opposite corners, you'll be unloading the opposite side's corner. But given that while passing through this, it gives you enough time to regrow enough to shear again, even if you push yourself over into another one and parts of this one are unloaded, it won't necessarily matter, because the amount of time that you've spent inside of it will be enough to actually allow all of the vines themselves to fully regrow. Now, I wanted it to be somewhat minimalistic, somewhat simplified. You're just traveling over the top of pressure plates and underneath trapdoors. Technically, you don't need a top trapdoor here. You can use a bottom one and then open it, so it means that you could build it before 1.2. But since one of the somewhat required ingredients is the Aqua Affinity helmet, it would put the earliest version to build this and use it at full efficiency as Beta 1.9 pre-release 4, since it's the first version with a proper enchanting table. Now, at the end of each row, there is a refilling station for the shear, and the farm itself tries its hardest to keep your inventory empty. And then over here, on both sides, this block and this block do not have water sources inside of them, making it to where we've got a little bit of a flow away from the edge here, because this edge here is right next to a water source on the other side, because as we're going around the corner, this diagonal water source is pushing you forward up against the block in front, giving you the alignment necessary to reach that fourth block, or fourth vine. Now, one of the insights that Deadly Dirt Block had was that if you weren't obsessed with keeping a clean inventory, you could remove this block here and put it backwards by one and place another vine here, allowing it to grow down into that slot, and then you could get a fifth vine. And one other insight that he noticed is also if you had, say for example, a block at every other location along through here, actually set over by one, but roughly at every location set over through here, you could have a vine growing, between both sides across the three, and that would allow you to shear a sixth vine that would technically be inside of your head slot. But those are a whole bunch of optimizations that would have come at the cost of a clean inventory, and after passing through the entire farm 9 times, which is how many shears you can fit in the dispenser, which later I guess could be replaced with a dropper, once droppers exist in the game, then your empty hand can accept the dropper, or accept the shear, and go through and break it one more time upon the next row, making it to where you don't have to do anything fancy that involves future versions and what is the word? Item frame? There was a cute design that I saw by Cortez Irino, where he wasn't using the soul sand, and that's part of where I got the idea for the soul sand. And at first I was even considering the idea that, let's see here, 1, 2, 3, the fourth is the soul sand, that underneath the soul sand I could either place a cobweb, water, or ice if I needed to further modulate the speed. However, on running the farm, I found that I was moving already at the perfect speed, and that I didn't need to go any slower, so the added complexity was better avoided entirely. Now, one thing that Keiko Chinovsky showed me while he was showing me a picture of a photograph alongside a flashlight, that that Mango had also done something similar to this, but in his designs, instead of making the sacrifice of just wearing a Aqua Affinity helmet, he was using complicated piston mechanisms to push the player forward and skipping every ninth vine, which I wasn't too much in favor of because I wanted to keep this as simplified as possible. And then there was one other one where he had an idea that actually looked kind of interesting that I chose to go without using, because it would use a depth strider boot, allowing you to be pushed slightly slower by a water stream, and then forsaking the soul sand entirely. And after looking at that, I did consider the idea for a brief moment before I decided that I really did want this thing to be as minimalistic as possible, and already relying on one piece of enchanted gear was enough for me, and that I didn't need to force myself to be using two pieces of enchanted gear. Now, if you've taken notice that these vines are very close to this line here, and that they could potentially drop on top of it, then I congratulate you for your observation skills. However, your shear should break by the time that you're actually breaking this vine, if not this one or this one. So by the time that you're at this final vine, you truly are only breaking it with your fist, and it's only meant to be an added extra bit of safety, because the two on the edge over here in both of these locations were very much so added after the fact once the entire testing model had been built up, and I decided that I would much rather just squeeze in a couple of extra vines, 3 rows worth of vines total, one at the start, two at the end, to just ensure that there was enough in the way of extra vines to safely shatter the shear inside of your hand before you exit. And by doing that, it also reduces some of the otherwise complex nature that something like this could have, because if your hand was not empty as you went over the dispenser, you would want to have a hopper in front of the dispenser to pick up the shear that you might not otherwise pick up with your hand, as well as activate that with a stone pressure plate, so that the item itself, its entity, wouldn't interact with the stone pressure plate in the same way that it would a wooden pressure plate, uh, allowing it to suck back up after your character had finished moving off of the block. But because I wanted it to work without hoppers as much as it possibly could, that's an added layer of complexity that I just don't need to include into such a design. And although I've seen many devices which use such a device, like Azuma's take on what's his name, Pi314 numbers, he did a sheep farm, and Azuma was inspired by his sheep farm to do another one, and both of them used the hopper feeding the item back into the dispenser via dropper beneath, as well as on Panda's Panda 4994, his original fish farm, which works technically from version 1.7 through version 1.9, although I have suspicions that there are versions before that where the fish farm should work, although in version 1.4, I'm having difficulty making it work because the bobber doesn't land where I expect the bobber to land. However, when I update my testing world to version 1.7, then the bobber starts landing in a location that I would expect a bobber to be landing. So something about fishing rods has changed several times very quietly over the versions, and I'm just not smart enough to figure out what, but I do notice that it has happened. Now, of course, once I'm in version 1.5, I can do things like adding in a hopper on top of the dispenser. I could place a double chest both above the player and above that hopper. I could have another hopper pointing into that double chest. I could have a rail line coming across everything, delivering more shears to each of the dispensers every so often when they actually run out. I could have a great number of things inside of such a device, but I wanted to make sure that its base level design was simplified to the point that it didn't need anything. And then, of course, if we come over to the other side, if I wanted to run this in, well, a version before 1.5, which I did run it a little bit and just kind of clog up the escape path using a block so that I could come back afterwards and grab all of the drops for putting the vines in each of the successive rows on my way through, because I think it's right about 3 minutes to travel through each column. Instead of doing something silly and janky like that, I could do something much more refined, like putting a unloading stream off into unloaded chunks, similar to like what I've done over at Spawn. And I'll probably head over to Spawn so that I can point at that specifically and show you exactly what I mean. But overall, I do believe that this is about one of the simplest and even fastest, and I would even go so far to say one of the fastest that you can build, time-wise, before version about 1.17 where the shearing speed of vines changes such that you're actually able to auto-mine them while inside of a minecart, and at that point I would just straight up go with Ray's design, because I don't think that anything could be faster than that period. So, that does put a tremendous version range to the entirety of the device before it becomes obsolete due to game mechanics changing. But even after that obsolescence point, it's still functional, although you would need to refresh the water paths just a little more often, because a shallow water path doesn't push as fast as a full depth water path. But really, by the point in time that that comes, you're better off just doing the entire thing from inside of a waterlogged minecart with wet socks. And now I'll dive out and head over to the spawn chunks. Okay, I'm not frozen anymore. And by unloading stream, what I mean to say is that way. That while doing this mining project, which was a monstrous endeavor, and technically I'm not finished until I do the walls, and I may yet go one block further in all directions. I don't know, but I'm not done until I do the walls. But while working, I was able to throw my inventory into these water streams. Wow, that makes me dizzy to look at that difference down there in the crack. And these water streams all combine, moving outside of spawn, and their distance is not so great as to make time enough to actually despawn the items inside of the streams themselves. And we can actually take a look at the chunk boundaries for once, because in, I want to say in 1.9 and perhaps in 1.2, all I had to do was walk up to about this edge here, and then I could see some jack-o'-lanterns in the distance. And then I needed to reduce the length of the water stream significantly to continue using it in its normal fashion. After that point, I had to reduce it by two chunks. But as you can see, over the top of each of these chunk borders, I've made sure that the water stream is flowing, so that even if they should for some reason lose their momentum while traveling across a chunk border, it can be gained before they hit a gap in the stream. And then by the time that we're at the end of the water stream, this is the point at which entities stop processing, and then if I pressed my face up against the glass, then it would load this chunk, or actually, it would load this chunk, which would make this one entity processing. However, that was changed, and it would only be this one that's entity processing if I intended to still use this unloading stream. However, I very well might not need it, and the few times that I have needed it, I was just able to bridge out a little bit with sandstone slabs until I could actually see it, and then remove it once I knew that I didn't need to use it anymore. And then, while I've been talking about mob spawners and grinders, I should probably go ahead and take a look down here at what was essentially the first true base that I built in this world. And this place really does bring back memories for me, happy ones. Because I spent a great long period of time here. Heh, and I didn't even bother mining all of the diamonds, as you can see. But over here, the one that's more fenced off is the skeletons, and the one that's less fenced off is the zombies. And yes, we're in a version with baby zombies now. But as they're pushed through, as I previously mentioned, there's a lot in the way of diagonal water streams, and right now they're being pushed very close to the area where the other spawner is before they enter the elevators themselves. Exiting, going back and forth to some degree until they've reached a centralized area over the top of that enchanting table that I used to use, and into an area where they get to see each other as they travel in opposite directions, up and out, and into the final spot where they'll fall and break their shins. both of them landing just diagonal of each other. And this is where I used to do a great deal of my grinding for XP. And part of the reason why I would grind for XP right here is because there is a bunch of cobwebs in this area, and I could jump up into the cobweb and use that for getting critical hits against the enemy, and I do believe that I even used that for hitting the skeletons. Because before 1.4.6, you can't enchant a shear with with Silk Touch, which means that you can't pick up a cobweb, which means that if you wish to use a cobweb inside of a mob grinder for those critical hits, they have to be a naturally generated cobweb, which meant that I really lucked out to find a pair of mob spawners so close to a spot that I could stand and jump into a cobweb for punching them down. That was very useful back in the day. Huh, I still have charcoal waiting for me here. Actually, a sword is the only thing that you can use in creative without. What? Did I use this cobweb then? I guess I did. There should be a button around there. There's the button. Okay, I must not have used this cobweb. It must have been this one. It's the only one that makes sense. For these ones, I must have just punched them down. But as you can see, even inside of there, it's using that exact same elevator that I previously described. Where we're being diagonally pushed into an area where there are 2 missing blocks in those locations, meaning that as they're dragged in, they're dragged all the way to the edge. And with that, I'll go ahead and let it go, because I've probably wasted way more than enough time. And I do hope that you have a good day. And even if you're new to Minecraft or a seasoned veteran, hopefully you find something inside of this work that's able to inspire you to do better. Do better than what? Do better than me? Do better than you've done previously. Just do better. And take care.